In this video, we're going to be talking about how to do questions 1 and 2 from homework 10.7. So before we can do question 1 and 2 though, notice I'm taking square roots and there's a negative underneath that radical. What number squared is minus 64? Well, that's not a real number. You know, minus 8 times minus itself, minus 8 times minus 8 is positive 64, not negative 64. Also on this one, the negative out in front there, I'm used to saying that. That's a minus 1 times something. But the square root of negative 4, how do I deal with that? What number times itself is negative 4? Well, up until now, we haven't had an answer for that. And so we're going to learn about the complex number I. All right? Sometimes also called imaginary. So the definition of the number, and it feels weird to say number when I write a letter, I. I'm putting it in quotes. What the heck is this? I is defined to be the square root of minus 1. It's an imaginary number. Notice that if we now square I, the square root of minus 1 squared is the square root of minus 1 times itself, which is just minus 1. I cubed. Well, I cubed is I times I squared. And we just learned that I squared is minus 1. So we've got I times I squared. We got I times minus 1, which is minus I. So I cubed is can be simplified to being minus I. And I to the fourth, well, I to the fourth, we can write it a variety of ways. We could say that that's I times I cubed, or we can just say it's I squared times I squared. It's a minus 1 times a minus 1. It's positive 1. Seems strange, huh? I to the fourth is positive 1. And then if we repeat, if we have I to the fifth, well, that's I times I to the fourth. And I to the fourth is 1. So I to the fifth could be simplified to just being I. I apologize, I've got a bit of a cold here. My voice is probably strange, right? And so if we keep adding on powers of I, we're going to go through this pattern where I is the square root of minus 1, I squared is minus 1, I cubed is minus I, and I to the fourth is I. I to the fifth will be I to the sixth, which is the square root of, we can even write the square root of minus 1. We're happy with that. I to the sixth will be minus 1. I to the seventh will be minus I to the eighth will be 1. I to the ninth will be back down here at I. We're just going to cycle through that. All right? So what we need to just focus on using, I know this all feels really new, but I is defined to be this number that's the square root of minus 1. That's not a real number, it's an imaginary number. Using this will allow me to do some simplifying of roots that we haven't done yet, been able to do to date. So let's talk through some examples. So the square root of 9 we know to be 3. The minus the square root of 9 is just a minus 1 times the square root of 9. It's just a minus 1 times 3. It's a minus 3. We can even leave that minus red. Okay? And so far, what we've learned is when we had the minus sign inside the square root, or any even root for that matter, we said there's no real solutions, or no real numbers here. No real number times itself is a negative number. But now that we have our imaginary number I, we can simplify this using our product property. The square root of negative 9, well, the square root of negative 9, that negative 9 is a minus 1 times 9. Using my product property, I can take the square root of minus 1 on its own times the square root of 9 on its own. And the square root of negative 1 is this new number, I. The square root of 9 is 3. Those guys are equal. And order doesn't matter in multiplication. 3i reads the nicest. Right? Let's box our answers. Okay. So if there is a minus sign in the front, that's just a negative 1 times that radical. If there's a minus sign underneath the square root, you're going to end up with an I, right? So look at these answers. 3 times a minus 1, and a 3i. Let's do another example just like this. All right, so I want us to do these 4 examples. Square root of 12, a minus 1 times the square root of 12, the square root of minus 12, and minus 1 times the square root of negative 12. Probably need a tiny bit more space. Okay, so the square root of 12, using my product property, I know that 4 times 3 is 12. You know, also 6 times 2 is 12, but the reason why I want to factor it this way is because 4 is a perfect square, and I'm looking at square roots. So this is the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 3 is the square root of 3, and we are done. Now the minus sign, again, right in front here, is just a minus 1 times the square root of 12. Right? We know the answer to the square root of 12. It's 2 times the square root of 3. So this answer is going to be minus 2 times the square root of 3. But let's go ahead and write out a few steps. Again, square root of 12. 12 is 4 times 3. We have a minus 1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. We have a minus 1 times 2 times the square root of 3, which I will go ahead and write as minus 2 root 3. Minus 2 times the square root of 3. right? Okay, so now when the negative is in the radical, we actually can take it out and see that we've got an I times the square root of 12. This answer is going to be I times 2 root 3. All right, but let's go ahead and see that by writing out all the steps. We've got 12, minus 12 is a minus 1 times a 4 times a 3 using my product property. This is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. The square root of negative 1 is defined to be this imaginary number I. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 3 is just the square root of 3. Now, order doesn't matter in multiplication. This probably reads the nicest, 2 root 3I. Make sure that you don't have this square root symbol go too far, because if it goes over the I, we're talking about the square root of I. And I don't want, this isn't the square root of I. What do we have here? We have just an I. So just make sure that you really do cut that off there. And we are done. Now lastly, this problem with both those negatives, each negative means something different. That one is a minus 1 times everything that we write after. And in simplifying minus the square root of 12, we got 2 root 3I. So my answer here is going to be minus 2 root 3I. But just because this is all new, I feel like walking through the steps again. Minus 12 is a minus 1 times 4 times 3. Using my product property, we're going to do the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. The square root of negative 1 is this new number I. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 3 is just the square root of 3. Again, order doesn't matter in multiplication, so I think a minus 1 times 2, a minus 2 times the square root of 3 times I reads the nicest. All right, so we've gone through enough work for you to be able to do questions 1 and 2. Let's go ahead and do question 1 together and practice inputting it into the calculator. All right, so question 1, the minus sign is underneath the square root. So we're going to have the square root of minus 1 times the square root of 64. The square root of minus 1 is I, and the square root of 64 is 8. And I think it just reads nicer if we say I times 8 is 8I. Submit, and we did excellent. Notice on question 2, we have a minus sign in front of the root. That's a negative 1 times everything that comes after. We also have a minus sign underneath the square root of the root. That will result in using that imaginary number I.